Good evening, everyone. I'm David Wisner. Welcome to another episode of Dukakis Center Live here on NFC's Web TV. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary season of public service initiatives at the Dukakis Center, the objective of which is to try to seek to inspire young people to take an active interest in public affairs, either by informing themselves or taking initiatives, being involved in community service projects, voting, campaigning, maybe even running a campaign for public office, as was the case recently when Greece had municipal elections throughout the country earlier in 2023. We're ending a cycle of events and webinars dedicated to the practice of democracy, where we consider campaigns, where we consider public discourse, where we consider various types of activism. We try not to have opinions or to endorse candidates or political parties per se, but we seek to offer something a little bit different in the way our fellow citizens might be thinking about an election or might be thinking about some political issue. The purpose of our gathering, this week, an in-person event that we hosted yesterday and 2 webinars on NFC's Web TV in the coming days, is to consider what we're calling the ecosystem of political analysis. And we're asking ourselves how well we're talking about elections at a time when half the population of the world are called upon to vote in elections somewhere in a country with a democratic system. What are we doing as analysts to contribute to this celebration of democracy, so to speak? We're not interested in the outcome and the commentary on the outcome and predictions of what we're going to anticipate in this or that country which has had elections. We're thinking about how we actually talk about politics and elections. Whence my panel this evening with 3 guests who excel in this sort of exercise. We're wondering in particular whether something is changing in the way we think and talk about politics as a result of the outcome of elections recently. And we're wondering how healthy the institution of political discourse is around the world, whether, in fact, we're in a golden age, whether somehow we're experiencing what many public analysts have called the decline and demise of democracy. So with me this evening, I have 3 guests. Rikard, Jozwiak, if I've said your name correctly, from Radio Free Europe, who excels in the sort of exercise about which we're going to discuss this evening. I have an old friend, Dimitris Papadimitriou from the University of Manchester, and a new friend, Jim Quirk from American University in Washington, D.C., a student of comparative politics. So I thought I would start with you briefly, Rikard, and ask you a few questions about what it is you actually do and how you define political analysis of the sort that you do for Radio Free Europe in your various briefings.
Thanks for having me, David. I think it's I think we do have a problem. The problem is the cacophony. I would call it like that. I think there are lots of brilliant political analysis out there, analysts as well, but it's just so much. And often we are talking amongst ourselves. And I find that is the big challenge going forward. We see more and more, I think, in a society that's more, they're bubbles. And we don't manage to penetrate each other's bubbles. And maybe we don't even want to sometimes. And I think that is the issue really here. Talking about the work I do, writing newsletters, trying to do explainers ahead of elections. Yes, they're well read, but I do feel that it's the same people that are reading them. It's people in academia, it's think tankers, it's other journalists. And that is perhaps the issue, because there are so many other forms now of people doing analysis as well, I'm thinking about YouTubers, I'm thinking about TikTokers, I'm thinking about what we call influencers. And they are often better at reaching a larger mass of people than we are, let's say the legacy media. So I think that's a challenge going forward. So I see rather a cacophony of voices and bubbles that are not really communicating with each other. We are talking within each other, just to each other. And that is the problem going forward.
Rikard, as you scan the European horizon, you think about countries in Europe that have had elections and maybe having early elections again, as is the case in Ireland, France, and Germany. And you think about the outcome of European elections and the relative turnout, the number of a percentage of eligible voters who actually go and vote in the election. What stands out, the one or two or three things that you would call to the attention of our viewers here throughout Greece?
I think it's clear that there is some sort of populist wave, mainly what we would call the right, but also to a left to a certain extent. You see that in the German regional elections. I do think that we have seen, most recently in the Romanian presidential election, someone who just campaigned on TikTok and did very well, Jozwiak, who's now in the second round and might actually be the favorite to win. And that was a complete and total surprise that pollsters didn't see. I mentioned pollsters as well. More often than not, I think they're getting it wrong now. And it goes back to what I talked before, that there are certain aspects of society which they can't poll very well. And the question is now if they ever will do that, or if pollsters, I wouldn't say calling them becoming redundant, but I do think we should take them perhaps a bit more with a pinch of salt. There were quite a few elections there, even the French parliamentary elections, where everyone was predicting a right-wing victory when it sort of ended up third, where we see that we sometimes overestimate the populism, sometimes underestimate them, but we rarely get them right. And that is the issue. What I would say my takeaway will be, yes, there is an anti-incumbent feeling right now. There is a lot of some sort of, let's call it right-wing populism. I know that's a brand scope, but and I do think there is an issue with polling. And that will be something I think we will see a lot more of going forward.
So just to follow up a little bit, Jim and I will be thinking in terms of the way we talk about politics in the United States, and we have our issues with polling. I'll ask you, Jim, about this in a brief moment. But is there a Europe-wide paradigm for trying to understand the phenomena that you're describing here? You're not just shooting off the cup, that there must be some consensus of opinion that this is the environment we face currently.
Yeah, no, but I do think it does exist. I do think we can talk about a pan-European sentiment. Let's call it a sentiment where we are becoming, we in a wider sense, Europeans are becoming much more inward-looking, and I think we can see that in America as well. It's about a feeling of wanting more security, both physical security and economic security. In other words, the days of free trade is gone. And I think there's a consensus with that. I think there's a consensus that actually many people in Europe want some sort of fortress Europe. They want us to be walled in, essentially, right? And that is something you see in pretty much everywhere right now. And it sort of has to do with issues like migration, immigration, but also economic security, I would say. And very much more that, the idea of natural champions, that the state should be there for you. So the sort of classical liberal and I thought economic liberal ideas are on the out everywhere. And that is the sort of I think there is an emerging consensus on that, and an emerging sentiment among the body politic, but also the demos in Europe right now.
Now, your briefings, as I alluded to earlier, seem to be quite comprehensive. You're writing for a policy-making audience. You're addressing a certain segment of the population. Presumably, you're trying to break through the different bubbles that you discuss. Are you successful with that specific form of political communication?
No. As a short answer, I'm not, actually. I realized we did some statistics over who's reading my stuff, and it is exactly the think tankers, academia and what I would call politicos, people who are in the political sphere, either as advisors or politicians themselves. And that's it. And it's very hard for me, I would say, to think about another way of reaching another audience. There have been talks about, shall I do TikTok videos? Shall I try to be funnier? Shall I be less serious? Maybe
take the tie off.
But I clearly that's something I need to discuss. But in terms of answering your question, no, I write for an audience that I know very well, and I have not managed to go beyond that.
Okay, let me turn to our second speaker this evening, Dimitris Papadimitriou. You've observed elections in the UK. Being a Greek citizen, you've observed elections going back to 2023 in Greece. And as a citizen of the European Union, member state of the European Union, you have been quite aware of what's happening throughout Europe. Do you concur with what you're hearing from our friend Rikard in Prague?
Yes, I think by and large, I agree with Rikard. But if you look in particular at the latest British election and the last Greek one, you could perhaps argue that the outcome of both of these elections was a vote for stability rather than change. That in both cases the safer pair of hands appear to be preferred by the electorate. But what we have seen subsequently, and this is where I think Rikard's point is a very good one, is a realization that support for Kyriakos Mitsotakis in Greece and Keir Starmer in the UK, it's actually much softer than we thought. So it seems to me that the tectonic plates of politics across what we might want to call the West are shifting, but are shifting in a way that we are not entirely sure. And therefore, we cannot always tell whether the electorate wants change or wants stability. It might claim to want change, but perhaps when it's presented without change, may not be so happy. It appears not to be liking stability in that sense, but I'm not entirely sure that it will be very happy with the alternative, which is instability and unpredictability. So I think I agree. The landscape, the media landscape, is becoming more fragmented. Our ability to understand what the electorate wants is severely compromised, I think. And you see this not only in the commentary, the political commentary on what's happening in various countries, you also see it in opinion polls. I mean, in both Greece and the UK, the opinion polls were more or less right. Well, more right in the UK, because in Greece, support for Syriza, the centre-left political party, was underestimated. So again, we see a lot of evidence of experts, the epistemic community, if you like, struggling to figure out what is going on. And that is an unhappy place for everybody, right? Because policymakers are not entirely sure which direction to take things. Opinion shapers are not entirely sure they can predict outcomes, and the US election is a good example of that. So I think that let's leave it at that. We know things are changing, but we're not entirely sure to what direction.
I'm curious now, considering the fact that you teach in the university, we've gone from the think tank, from the person who's addressing the policymaker directly as any of us can. What is the reception of this, your analysis of the environment among your students, for example, in a British university?
mean, I've been teaching in the UK for 30 years, and I am a very passionate pro-European, by the way, and I used to teach the main EU courses here in Manchester. And during the Brexit referendum, which a few years back now, I used to say to my students, go out and vote, because I don't see things going the right way. But I struggle to mobilize them. This kind of apathy that we see in official turnout figures for elections everywhere. I mean, recently in the Irish election, just over 60%. Greece on that level as well. In Eastern Europe, levels of voter apathy which are even worse. Mm-hmm. Young people are not immune by this. In fact, the problem is even harder among young people, and that also includes politics students, surprisingly. So I may be a terrible teacher, I don't know, but my sense is that even those with an intense interest and intense pessimism about the direction of politics right now may not turn up to vote. And what will make these people vote is the big question mark. Just to remind your viewers, I mean, I am the only born Greek person here. David is an adopted Greek, I imagine, but I recall in the 1980s, levels of political participation and voter turnout in Greece. Yes. That was in the 90s. Yes. And we always used to think, it's incredible. Greeks love their politics. They like to argue. They never agree on anything, but they still like a good argument. Well, now I think that having gone through a very protracted period of crisis, which you would have thought would have mobilized people to change things, to rebuild things, and so on, what we see is very high levels of voter apathy, which in fact is not too dissimilar to the levels of voter apathy we saw in Eastern Europe following the collapse of communism. Initially, we thought the early democratic politics would boom. Very soon, that kind of intense interest collapse into voter apathy. And this is what we see in Greece too, I think.
Yeah, I might just remind our audience that you have an interest in politics in Southeast Europe, having written a book, I think, about Romania at the early point of your career, and how Romania negotiated to become a member state of the European Union and what it meant for the citizenry in that country. Jim, I'd like to turn to you. Do you hear things that sound familiar? Are these the commiserations that you have with your colleagues? And I just point out here, we have the average worldwide turnout for it's about 1,600,840,000 citizens who have voted in elections thus far this year. That doesn't include the 5 million Greeks who voted last year in the parliamentary election. And it doesn't reflect the fact that some 90 million Americans didn't vote in our election in November. The average turnout is 61% for elections in 2024. And I think in the United States, we'd be shocked to know that we're a little bit above average, even though we didn't quite get to the point this year that we saw in 2020, the presidential election that pitted Joe Biden with Donald Trump in 2020. But I'm curious, Jim, as you're listening to your European colleagues here, are we speaking the same language, or is the United States in another universe altogether?
I would say both of those things are true a little bit. That a lot of the comments we've heard about how do we reach people, how do we find out what people are actually thinking? How do we do good polling? How do we do good communications, either from campaign to voters or from scholars and pollsters trying to understand voters? All of those things are common. I would say there's maybe a couple of differences as well. One is that, at least at our university, our students are very active. They all work on campaigns. They all do their early voting. I know that's a little unusual in the general population, but if it's 60% US wide, I would say my students are probably 95% or something like that. But there are some important differences too that I think I've heard in the last few minutes. And some of this is kind of reflected from it. One of the items I would say is I think 100 countries had elections this year. And there's a couple more this week, but I think it's over 100 countries. And there's lots of things going on in the world. But across the board in the media, and I think to a pretty big extent in academia, the US presidential election crowded out every other story. And for the stories that we did talk about, and I mean in the media or at the dinner table or in the classroom, a lot of times those stories were viewed through the lens of the US presidential election.
Right.
And so part of that is kind of ethnocentrism and navel gazing. Part of it is because this is an important election globally. Part of it is the candidates, right? Donald Trump takes up a lot of oxygen, and the Democrats chose their nominee in an unusual form. So there were a lot of things going on, but I would not say there was a lot of talk about elections around the world because the US presidential election took up so much of that space.
Okay, or maybe there were some surprises like India, when the expectation was that Modi would do much better than he did, or France, that they have a hung parliament. The stories haven't really generated that much. You don't get to the front page with stories about elections in Europe, for example, and nobody really cares, to my mind, in the United States about the elections to the European Parliament. So, in fact, you're rather skewed in your view to the rest of the world. There's a kind of imperialism. But does that actually extend to the way you conduct your analysis? Is there a prototype that we would expect to see in our European colleagues, the way they talk about outcomes of elections?
I think there's a couple different parts to that answer, right? When we are doing real comparative politics, when we are looking over the horizon, some people do this with a regional focus. So maybe you're really interested in the elections in Japan or Turkey or Mexico, but maybe you're not interested in all of them. That's one group of people. And another group of people is looking to see, are there global trends, right? For a long time, we've had this kind of democracy is softening around the world, democratic recession. Are we seeing things like an anti-incumbency? Are we seeing violence around elections? What is the populist right doing? Are they still rising or not? Is there a resilience center? So people are doing their regional expertise. People are looking for big global things. And people are looking for that kind of combination of these big things are going on in the world. Mexico matters to the United States. The UK and France are big, important democratic allies, and stability there is good for stability in Europe. India, giant democracy with some issues in the last few years. So these kinds of questions arise, and we do pay attention to them. But if these things had happened in a year without a U.S. presidential election, I think they would have gotten a lot more of the attention they deserve.
Okay. To the extent, for example, that President Biden had made this one of the cornerstones of his approach to domestic and foreign policy, the threats to democracy, the need to uphold democracy, the fact that the White House hosted a summit for democracy back in 2021. Is it entering the minds of the consumer of the sorts of information that you're able to share about the political scenarios in these different countries?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people for whom this is a real issue and a real concern and a priority. But for many more kind of average voters who don't do the kind of thing we're doing most of the time, they're interested in kitchen table things and job things and some of the cultural things that we're debating in the U.S. But much more U.S. focused. I think Americans are often America focused, but maybe more so this year than even in other years.
Okay. And one suspects that they may be accentuated now with Donald Trump returned to the White House for another 4 years. Dimitri, I'll turn back to you a little bit and ask you to comment a little bit about the way Greeks are viewing what's happening throughout the world in places where there have been democratic elections, whether you would distinguish as a Hellene yourself between a national election or a municipal election or a European election, whether you would view the US elections with the same sort of interest that Americans expect other people to view our elections. How do you feel as a Hellene thinking about the way we talk and think about elections around the world, this year in particular, but in general?
I think that of most Southern European nations, the Greeks tend to be more interested in global affairs, not least because I think there are historical reasons for this as well, because Greece was a frontline state during the Cold War. So what happened in the world mattered. Patron nations matter for many Greeks. So I think that there is interest on what happens around the world, but there is also very poor quality of information available in Greece, and that is something that perhaps is a uniquely Greek problem, although perhaps not so uniquely, in the sense that Greece has a relatively, also by virtue of its size, of course, a relatively small epistemic community. It's a partisan epistemic community as well. A lot of sort of expert knowledge in Greece tend to be often consumed by partisan interests. So in that sense, we are moving closer to America, or perhaps America is moving closer to Greece. There is also a very partisan and to some way manipulated media landscape. That Greece does have a public broadcaster, which is not very widely used. Most of the popular media is controlled by big business, by oligarchs and so on, and that inevitably skews the quality of information that is available to Greece. So that creates a particularly, peculiarly Greek cocktail, let's say, one where people are interested about what happens in the world, often think they know what's happening in the world, but in reality, they're not very well informed, and they can often be easily manipulated. And that is something that, as I said earlier, is not. It has been a long-term feature of Greek public life. We see it a lot more happening everywhere now around the world. So, in a way, Greece is no longer such a great outlier, but other countries that are heading that direction perhaps matter more than Greece, and that's the worry for all of us.
Well, I'll put Rikard on the spot. I think you're joining us from Prague, if I'm not mistaken. Does Greece appear the outlier that Dimitris is describing? Are there other countries within Europe? Would you be able to rank the public awareness of your average citizen in the countries throughout the European Union? Is it a generalized kind of problem that we're describing here, or are there spaces in Europe where people are a little bit better off, a little bit better aware, willing to debate, willing to take the advice of analysts who claim to have expertise in the field? What is your general view of this, Rikard?
Well, I do. I mean, I'm not an expert on Greece per se as such, but I always had a feeling that Greeks, as Dimitris pointed out, they care about their politics, and I think it has to do with I mean, it's the home of democracy after all, right? So you do have the legacy in a sense, right? So that's the sort of thing, and the whole idea about agoras, people talking to each other, people discussing politics. I think that's something that is quite Greek in a certain sense, right? But I do think there are certain places where there's been a reawakening of politics as well. I'm thinking about a country I know quite well, which is Poland, which last year actually had a huge record turnout in their parliamentary elections after 8 years of, let's say, populist rules. The sort of more center-right mainstream party won. And what was interesting there was that there were record viewings of the first session of the Sejm, of the Polish parliament, with a very engaging new speaker. And there was actually young people turning in to watch, parliamentary TV, as in live streaming of the European Parliament, of the national parliament in Poland. So that I do see that, like, for example, in Poland, there is a great a revival in a certain sense, right? So that's something that bucks the sort of Central Eastern European stream of people being less and less interested in politics. But I do think very much that it has to do more and more, and I'm going to come back to that perhaps in the future when we're going to talk about sort of the health of democracy or not. Political parties are on the way out, but political personalities are always interesting for people. We see that par excellence with Trump. But Macron is another person like that, who basically was a one-party, the whole party around him revolves around him. You see that in Germany with Sarah Wagenknecht, the sort of far-left firebrand as well. I think we're going to see more and more of these sort of things where you have a very strong personality that engages people. So I do think that, we're not going to talk very much more about sort of left, right, and so on, but rather about, what do you think about Donald Trump? Do you love him? Do you hate him? Did you hear what he says and so on? So I do think in general that the political discourse is there. It's just revolving and it's becoming more personalized.
Okay. So we seem to experience a kind of fragmentation. And I had a question from one of the students who are watching here in the audience, whether there's some desirability to have a United States of Europe as a way of having a uniform approach to political discourse, or is it inevitable that the Greeks are going to think about politics from their point of view, given the legacy of, the modernity of the Greek state and independence of the Greek state? Or are we going at some point in time to think like Europeans when it comes to our democratic politics? I'm asking you, Rikard, in particular. Perhaps Dimitris has an opinion on this also.
I don't think there is such a thing as a European demos, and I don't think there will ever be. I always thought that there could be such a thing after my years in Brussels. But then I did the healthy thing of leaving the Brussels bubbles, where everything is very sort of EU, and I moved to Prague a few years ago, and I realized that they don't care about EU politics that much. They are following it from a very Czech angle, and I realized that's often the case from pretty much all national capitals bar Belgium, in a sense. But even in Belgium, there's a very sort of very Belgified political view as well. So I don't think so. I mean, the European Parliament elections is essentially 27 national elections. That's what it is. People go and vote for things that matters to them, and it's often local, regional, national issues. It's very rarely that someone casts a vote in a European election thinking about something, what they would like to see in Europe. So I don't think we're never going to move to the United States of Europe because our national identities are so entrenched. Many nations trace back to 1,000 years or even longer. Greeks even longer. So, and that's very, very, very entrenched. I noticed that. And I think actually with globalization also comes greater localization, and people cling on even more to these sort of roots as well. So I don't have much hope of some sort of United States of Europe, European federalism, European demos. I hope Dimitris can contradict me, but I don't have the hope.
No, I don't. I don't disagree with this. I think that the very, very tentative steps that Europe has taken in developing a European demes lies at the heart of it. That there isn't a strong European demes, but the tragedy, in a way, or the problem that the Europeans are facing right now is that many of the big issues that are affecting their everyday life and their security can only be dealt with at the European level. So what you have is a disjuncture. On one hand, people are thinking for solution through national frames, but ultimately the defense, trade, the environment, immigration, and so on, all of these issues cannot really be resolved at a national level. So you have a disjuncture between the locus of the problem and the locus of the solution. And European leadership, or the lack of European leadership, aggravates that problem, right? Because I'm thinking, I was researching the early transition to democracy in Eastern Europe 30 years ago. Then the Europeans had a much clearer, or European leaders had a much clearer view of what needed to happen. They were proactive. They were able to inspire the population to go along with their vision. Now, within Europe, less so. But we also have a paradox as well, that even though many Europeans are thinking through their national frames, the Czechs, the Greeks, the Germans, increasingly the French, at the same time, we have people at the streets of Tbilisi waving EU flags. We had people in Ukraine dying in the streets supporting a European vocation. So the picture is more complex, but it's not one that Europe has irreversibly become irrelevant, but is certainly one where the European vision, if you want to call it that way, is very vague and weakening.
I want to turn to the question of the media environment. We seem to have a bit of a paradox to say we agree on an awful lot of things with respect to the status of the way we talk about politics, the way we want to analyze what's happening, and yet there isn't a uniform framework within, or an umbrella framework within which we work. What about the media environment? We had a journalist who's now writing with Axios, Mike Allen, who's coined the phrase shards of glass. That is to say, everything is fractured to some extent. There isn't now an umbrella media service that would reach out to all citizens, or the vast majority of citizens who care about the outcome of an election. Is that an adequate metaphor? I'll start with you, Dimitri, because Jim, I'll start with you because Mike is talking about what's happening in the U.S., but I'll ask all of our panelists here to comment on this. Is it an adequate metaphor? Is this what we face now, that there's no putting the jar back together once it's fallen off the shelf and smashed into several pieces?
Yeah, I love that when I saw that, and it made me think kind of in an idealized way about one thing I'll mention in a moment, but also in a much more pragmatic way in which maybe he's really onto something. My idealized moment was that shards of glass, if we understand them correctly and we're able to put them in the right order and understand where they belong and what they're meant to be, we can create this beautiful mosaic when we stand back and see the big picture.
Okay.
Right? So that's kind of an idealized version. Like, hey, we haven't been able to do that yet, right? And I think there's a demand side, maybe and a supply side for that. Who you are really determines a lot of the things about what you want to learn and where you want to learn it. And media and scholars and campaigns and pollsters haven't figured that out yet how to do that. So, for example, we have some of the same, in a very different way, federalism issues that they have in Europe. If the people in New York and California see things differently than people in Texas or Florida, that's easy to say. But I think one of the things we share is this kind of urban versus rural distinction among the way we see politics. And certainly, I think finally people are talking about income levels, not just race and ethnicity or geography, but income. I saw the term the laptop class, right? People who shower in the morning before work versus people who shower in the afternoon after work, right? They have different approaches, different concerns, different backgrounds. And so your age and your income and your education and your job help determine whether you're going to sit with grandpa and watch BBC and CNN, or whether you're going to be listening to a podcast targeted to a narrow, young, particular group of people who learn about politics and society that way. And so, like Rikard and Dimitris have both said, is we have very segregated, somehow self-segregated populations kind of listening for different things and interested for different things, but also learning about these conversations and engaging in these conversations in very different places, right? We don't all go to the 6 o'clock news and read the New York Times and everybody's got the same information and the same, we don't have that at all. And it took the campaigns and the media and the scholars. It was really late in this cycle before they said, hey, you know what? Some people are listening to podcasts. A lot of people were very late on that. My kid, watches scrolls through TikTok all day.
Okay.
That's where people learn.
So if I may here, just to add one more.
Please.
One more point. I mean, there is, of course, the issue of fragmentation. We've all mentioned it. It's pretty obvious. But I think there are also issues about the national broadcasters. I live in the UK. I see some of the controversies over the BBC, for example. 20 years ago, that was a sacred cow. No one ever touched the BBC. You took the BBC's world for granted. But what I've noticed, particularly in the context of Brexit, but also during the this campaign for the American election, that the role of a national broadcaster, of a broadsheet newspaper, of a sort of respectable media outlet is how to present a balanced view. Many people, for example, in the UK would accuse the BBC in 2016 of sort of giving equal credence to a mainstream argument about the benefits of multilateralism, for example, with a very fringe view on Brexit or hard Brexit, or whichever way you want to call it, which was factually problematic. And from one hand, the BBC was trying to present both views, but both views did not have equal a claim to factual accuracy. So one of the things that have made me smile at the BBC in the last couple of years is that they introduced a new a service called fact-checking. So every time they were reporting from the US, they were taking every claim that each of the candidates made and fact-checking. Now, there are problems with that approach, of course, as well, because truth sometimes is not so clear-cut. But the fact that it has come down to it gives you an indication of how even mainstream media are finding difficult to respond to a legitimate demand by the viewers for objectivity and balanced coverage.
We've had fact-checking in the United States for I don't know how long. And now there were fact-checking claims that there was voter fraud in 2024. And the first report I saw was there was no voter fraud anywhere. And that's when I went to bed, incidentally. Look here, I read two things just within the last 2 days. On the one hand, somebody had this wise quip that read as follows: voters don't think like political analysts. And the second quote I saw was somebody was thinking about what the Democratic Party should be doing in the United States, given the fact that their candidate lost the presidential election, is to find shortcuts. That was the metaphor. Shortcuts for reaching the public more directly. What are some of these shortcuts? Because it's a problem for all of us. It's fine if we have university students. It's fine if we're like Rikard and we have subscribers who read your newsletter avidly. Can't wait for the day of the month when the next newsletter has come out. And I think it was today for me. And I read it. It was on top of my list. But I think we're in a bit of a minority and we are not reaching voters, are we? Unless we're reaching youthful voters who vote. Let's say the university students, they're not a majority anymore of young people. And apparently young people are not listening to us. And we tend to be somewhat center-left in our view of the political system. They're voting for Donald Trump. They're voting for populists. They're voting for right-wing parties. In Greece here, for example, this was the phenomenon, I think, that stunned a lot of analysts that, gee whiz, why are so many young people voting for New Democracy and Kyriakos Mitsotakis? It was a phenomenon. We couldn't understand that. So is there a way, is there a shortcut that gets us closer to the voter? And are we able somehow to understand that voters don't think like analysts? Do we have to change our language because we're not educating? We'll come back to the question of education a little bit, but we're not getting through. We're not cracking the egg, if that's an adequate image for this particular problem. Rikard, why don't you start us off on this, because you had the initial observation earlier.
This is the thing. Something struck me with Dimitris when he talked about fact finding, and it's sort of like, and this is the problem. I think with us, if I can call us, whether it's a professor or a journalist from a mainstream media, that we are obsessed about facts, and that sounds perfectly normal to us. Of course, we're dealing in facts.
Yeah.
But the problem with facts is that it takes a long time to figure out what is actually fact. So when we talk about fact finding, and it's something I've done a lot, you know, when my editor calls me and says, can you check if this is true? Are the Dutch really thinking of that? Are the Greeks really changing from the euro to this and that, like that? It takes ages to check something correctly. Normally, to see that it's facts, you need 1, 2, 3 sources. You probably need a document. You need to verify the document. Sometimes fact finding takes months. And by that, the train has left a long time ago, especially in this media environment. No one cares 6 months ago what was then the fact. So we come with something and say, yeah, in fact, it was true. We can sort of establish it's true now. People have already forgotten it. And now I come with a sort of thing. I actually don't think, and this is controversial what I'm probably going to say, but I have a feeling, and this is the sort of thing, people in general don't care too much about facts. They care about feelings. And the way you can approach a larger sum of people is actually to tap into their feelings and understanding their feelings, and then tailor your message to that. And I know, like, oh my God, this is populism. We are steering away from facts and so on. No, I mean, the facts are still there. But I think sometimes we are too obsessed about getting everything absolutely correct, and we're missing the train. And that will be the challenge going forward, that we are too slow and too obsessed by something that very few people actually are obsessed about.
So the comment is coming.
That is the challenge for us, but I'll leave it at that. And now it's for Jim and Dimitris to pick up the pieces.
The comment is coming, and we're dinosaurs, and we can't get out of our shadows fast enough, and we're going to be wiped out. It seems like we're describing the demise of political analysis as an institution in a healthy democracy. But Jim or Dimitri, you want to take up where Rikard has just left off?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. Of course, feelings are very important, and there is a very big literature on politics and feelings. But I think there is you can flip that argument in some way and say it's not that people don't care about the facts, is that the problem perhaps may be that the fundamentals don't change.
Mm-hmm.
So that people see that inequalities persist, that their relative position is weakening, that they cannot afford to do X, Y, and Z. So for them, the facts are that you know they cannot manage. Seeing that they cannot find somebody who can change it for them, they resort to feelings. So perhaps the issue is not that there are some people who are more successful in appealing to the feelings of the electorate. The problem may well be that there isn't enough money to go around, and everything else is peripheral to this. That if people's material position improved, as it has been improved for decades after the war, they wouldn't need to resort to feelings. They would know their material position is better, and they would act accordingly. If you accept that an increasing section of the population is living now worse than it used to 20 years ago or 30 years ago, it's not that they don't care about the facts, it's that the facts are not very good.
Okay, until you get to the point where left off any Parkun, right? So we had,
indeed.
Yes, to inverse a famous note by the former Greek Prime Minister Yorgos Papandreou. Jim, do you want to follow up a little bit on this particular issue?
I would just say a couple short things. Maybe one is that I think it's really encouraging it's easy for us to be discouraged. If I say, well, my students don't read the newspapers I think they should read every day. Mm-hmm. But they're getting their information lots of other places. They're not unengaged. They're just engaged in places we haven't been looking, right? And haven't been noticing. And that's important for us to know. But one of the caveats, I think, if in terms of political analysis and quality, is sometimes we look back. Well, what happened in the last election? Where did people get their information? And what drove voters in the last election? And then we apply that to this year, or, the current election, and we're missing what's actually going on that's different this time. I think that was one of the problems we had.
We're litigating last year's case, yes.
Or investigating last year's case, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And not finding this year's news. I think that was, but the idea that the young people are really engaged, we just don't see it because that's not where we live and look. I think that was very encouraging for us this year.
I gave you the metaphor of the shards of glass, but we also look at the macro situation. One of the questions that's just been sent to me, it was something that came up yesterday. We had Altman Granitsas, the former Wall Street Journal bureau chief in Athens, talk about the demise of local media. He said that people in a certain neighborhood or a certain part of Greece or in a county somewhere in a state in the United States, or far from Brussels, somewhere in a member state of the European Union, aren't getting information about what really matters to them in their community. Is this also part of the problem that you have as analysts, getting the facts and the information, or generating a feeling that would be useful for people who are going to go and vote in an election? Is the fragmentation of the demise really of the local media as problematic for you as I see it being in the United States? Rikard, come to you again.
I do think it is a problem, yes. Because ultimately, I do think that people actually care what's going on in their mainstream, their high street, their quarter, their little town. We tend to be, many of us who are in these fields tend to be very cosmopolitan, but we tend to forget most people are not. And what they really matters for them is the sort of the simple stuff. Is the school still open? Are there any shops around here? Why is there no highway? Why are they closing down the post office? These sort of things. And local media has, in many places, completely disappeared, and they have not been replaced by anything that is equally good or commensurate. I mean, of course, there might be sort of like, local podcasts and so on like that, but the whole idea of local media has to a large extent disappeared, and I do think it is a problem. Absolutely.
Okay. Dimitris, because you've seen this in the variety of places where you've lived and worked, and you're familiar with the Greek case, and I suppose it's a problem in the UK also.
Huge problem in the UK, which has a very, very long tradition of local media. I think I was smiling. I've never thought of that, and I think it's a very good point that you're raising, David, and Rikard gave a very good answer there too. I think what is interesting, I was reading the other day that most of the local newspapers in the UK now is owned by a multinational publishing organization. So go figure, it's how things have changed. I don't want to call myself a dinosaur. My kids might want to use that expression, but I do see the replacement of local media by Facebook groups. I mean, where I live in a small community in the middle of nowhere. People are grouping together to share information in that way. That's not necessarily a bad thing at all. But if you also attach a kind of an accountability, a local accountability dimension to this media function, obviously Facebook cannot do that. You need journalists to hold local officials to account, but local journalism, as you both said, has disappeared. And I totally agree with Rikard that this is a big problem.
Okay. We had Poughkeepsie Journal in the Mid-Hudson Valley, and that was a locally owned newspaper. That's what I read growing up, and I would go to the sports pages every day. And then it was bought up by Granite, a big company. We raised this issue yesterday, also the consolidation of local media, so that there's nothing local about the way the news is actually delivered. You're thinking about your bottom line. You're thinking about a story that you can syndicate and share with a variety of different places in the country. And it's no longer local news made by or recounted by local citizens. Tell me a little bit in 2 words, to the extent that you can do so, what the future of social media is. We had a lot of questions here from our students asking about whether we want to have politicians actually using social media as a way of trying to develop these shortcuts directly to citizens, whether we need some sort of education to help people understand the nature of algorithms, for example, the question we rose again yesterday. It's impossible we would dedicate an hour or 2 to that question alone, but just a few salient points that stand out in your mind. Jim, I'll start with you, because we have now Elon Musk, who's going to be doing something in an official capacity in the Trump administration, and he owns this massive money-making social media.
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. It's interesting where people get their news has to be where candidates and has to be where the elected officials go to say what's going on. There are a couple members of Congress who do really good Instagram and TikTok reports every couple days or every once a week, and they're sober and calm, and they say, this is the questions that we're facing. Here's what I'd like to do about this. Here's how you contact me, in a very regular, personal, one-on-one way on people's phone. And lots of people see that would never see it if it was an interview in a newspaper. And so I think the best campaigns and the best electeds, people already in office, are kind of taking care of that. And more will, I think, and more should. On the parts to be wary of. I think we missed something globally this year in our 100 elections or whatever that was really good and we can't count on in the future. And that is, I think there was no AI catastrophe that got spread across social media and had an enormous impact. And I don't think we could say, okay, that didn't happen, we're all good. I think we have to remain vigilant on that possibility inside social media.
Personally, I think that's a problem with the mainstream media, that they're pumping these stories that didn't come to pass, with all the stories about the polling being as close as someone wanted me to believe the election was. It wasn't nearly as close as the pollsters suggested it was, but there wasn't, this widespread voter fraud. There were no lawsuits, and there was no, as you called it, an AI catastrophe. It's there potentially in the future, but that's something that we blew out of the water, I think. Yeah, either of you gentlemen on the bottom of my screen want to pitch in there or chime in about the social media in general? You were saying initially, Rikard, that you have difficulty reaching a broader audience, no matter how hard you try. First of all, I get your newsletter via email. And 10 or 15 years ago, that would have been revolutionary. Now it seems so quaint and old-fashioned. So how do you reach out to a bigger audience using the social media? How do the think tankers do that?
No, I still use X, and it still works for me. In fact, it sort of has been. It has actually helped me a lot in a sense, right? Because the good thing about X as well is that you can, as a journalist, if you have a breaking story, you just put it out there, right? You don't have to, in a sense, you're circumventing your editors a bit as well. You're becoming a bit of a Trump yourself, right? Because of course you do speak with editors and so like that. But in a sense, we've become quick as well at sort of spreading news and do live tweets and these sort of things. I think social media in general is wonderful. It's a fantastic tool, right? And you're connecting with people that you would never ever connect before. But going back to your questions about, politicians will have to be, as Jim pointed out, where the voters are. They are on social media, and they have to engage with them, and they have to be more personal and open up more. But there are wonderful opportunities there as well. So I'm not actually that negative. I think there's sort of like, there could be even sort of a democratization moment here as well, where my hope is that, we'll get away from political parties, which I think have become so stuffy and so mafia-like, and that people that may not have stood a chance to be elected actually can do that through very smart and engaging personal political campaigns on Twitter. And we see more of that, or social media in general.
Okay, but you could say the same of Donald Trump. He would never have been elected in the Republican Party of, let's say, Ronald Reagan.
Exactly, but in the same time, there can be positive elements of that as well. That we, because I think the problem is in the last sort of 20 years that we just get these sort of, sort of like lifetime politicians that have just been politicians their whole life, or you get the corporate lawyer who's just changing career. And now I think it has actually opened up an opportunity that the local baker, a local police officer, whatever you have, a student who's really into it, can run for politics as well and break these sort of like, and kill those dinosaurs that are the old political parties that I think should be blown off anyway.
A story we heard yesterday, one of our speakers ran in a municipal election in Kalamaria, a suburb of Thessaloniki, and he said the top vote getter in the municipal election was a local mailman, because he knew everyone and everyone knew him. He didn't even need social media. Yeah. So, but it's the same idea that somehow you create an audience for yourself, and that you trust people to judge whether you have the character sufficient to be a public official, I suppose. Dimitris, you want to say something?
Yeah, just to say that political communication was never unmediated in history. There were always mediators in the relationship between politicians and voters. A few decades back, there might have been media barons, mega journalists, and so on. Now it's something else. I think that We need to be careful not to demonize the medium through which the message travels. And now it's social media, so be it. There is no major problem to my mind with this. But equally, we don't need to demonize the medium, but neither do we need to glorify the message. Because ultimately, what matters is what improves people's life, not the message. You know, the British have a very good expression: you cannot polish a turd. You know, people sometimes can smell the turd, so whatever you tell them, they won't believe you.
I'm sure Cheech and Chong would have something to say about that. Jim will get that one. Rikard, I interrupted you a moment ago. You wanted to say something further to my comment.
No, sorry.
Okay. The question that's just been passed to me is how representative social media is, because it seems to be it's only a segment of the broader public that are really active using it, and it may be the younger generation in particular. So don't we've created another sort of bubble here that people get their information. And let me just share something that I saw. It was an analysis that has been done about what we call news attentiveness in the United States. And a majority of people who voted for Kamala Harris, as far as can be ascertained, read the newspaper, hard copy or online, or watch TV news. 50% or more of people who voted for Donald Trump do not do so at all. They're not engaged with traditional media in any way. And it's hard to avoid the conclusion that we have this fundamental fragmentation, again, of society with respect to the information we receive, the quality of the information we receive, and the motives of the person who share that information. I'm afraid that I'm the only person who's a little pessimistic here. I've heard some wonderful things, and it's a public service initiative that you're highlighting some of the positive effects of the shards of glass of the social media environment here. But it just seems to me there's a bit of a risk there, which leads me maybe to the final segment of our discussion today, the relative health of the institution of political analysis and the health of our democratic systems in general. It was a theme that we discussed several instances last night with the guests I invited to speak at our in-person event. It says, we have this paradigm now since 2016, really, that democracy seems to be dying. And is this phenomenon that we're discussing here a symptom of that? Or are we overblowing the idea that just because someone who seems to challenge the norms of the system in place has been elected, that must be the death of democracy? Are we overblowing this idea that democracy is dying around the world? Should we be happy that 61% of our populations worldwide are voting in election, and accept that there are 40% who are just not going to vote no matter what? Gentlemen, what do you think? Is democracy dying? Is what we're talking about here, political analysis, the media landscape, part of the problem, or are we missing something? I'll start with you again, Rikard.
No, I think democracy is alive and kicking. It is changing. I think that, choosing not to be part of democracy is also, in a sense, a democratic choice. I mean, in a sense, what I feel is, the positive thing I have is, as I alluded to before, I do think it's good actually that political parties are on the way down. You sort of read about membership in political parties on the way down. I think eventually that can be a good thing. So I'm quite optimistic still, and it's one thing that I think is actually quite good, and that is that choices are quite clear now when it comes to politics. I remember I grew up in a time, so I'm 40 years old now. So I was born in the 80s, and I voted for the first time in my life in 2000. the complaint among young people, and this was deep into sort of like, the end of history, Francis Fukuyama things that would march towards democracy and liberal market economy and so on, was, I remember among my peers, was I can't tell the difference between the parties anymore. They just stand for the same thing. They're all in the center, and like the difference between right and left was sort of like, well, some wanted 45% taxation and some 35%, and maybe the right wing was a bit more keen on privatizing health. That was the political discourse when I was a young voter. We couldn't tell the difference anymore. Now, you can definitely tell the difference, and there are a lot of differences, and there's a clear choice what you want, and in many ways you see also there are clear consequences of what you elect. And I think that was one of the reasons you saw, for example, in Poland, that people turn away from populism, because suddenly many women realized, oh my God, I can't have an abortion anymore. There are direct consequences. So, in a sense, I'm hopeful. Politics and democracy are changing, but I think both are alive and kicking, but in different ways.
Okay. Jim? A fellow optimist?
I think I am a fellow optimist. With a little caution at the beginning, I would say that while celebrity candidates can bring in new energy and new ideas and new perspectives, I think there's also some value at being in the state house before you're in Congress, or being a governor before you're president. I think there's some value there, that you don't come right from being TikTok famous to, positions of power. But I do think more broadly that democracy is still widely respected enough that even very undemocratic countries go through the motions of elections. So look, we're having elections because that's the only way we can show that we're a legitimate government, even though there's no democracy there at all. Going through the motions demonstrates that they recognize that people still value that, whether it's outsiders or insiders or not. Okay. So I'm more positive, I think, as well.
Okay. So, Dimitri, I don't know, the onus is on you to keep the record clean, but Greeks tend not to be as optimistic as people in other places. Tell me.
I think that the worry here ought to be a very evident normative retreat of pluralism that manifests itself in different ways. It manifests itself in a very low tolerance for other people's opinion, very low tolerance for balancing institutions, for keeping check and balances in place. And that can be dangerous when problems that we all share become very resilient and very difficult to resolve, because the irresistible urge then would be that if we cannot crack a problem through consensus, through the normal give and take that all politics involve, then there must be a shortcut. I don't like shortcuts. I think that those who promise shortcuts to difficult problems, they will not resolve the problems, and then at some point further down the line will say that it's not my fault that I didn't resolve the problem, it's because other people have different opinions. And that's something that I wouldn't like to see going forward.
Okay, we do a little scapegoating then. Last question has to do with education, and I'll just have an open roundtable. We have a couple of questions on that also. They say, how can we improve? Or where do we reach out to people to share what we know and to contribute better, and impress upon young people in particular that they can come to us still and get some information that might be useful, without our telling them, no, you're wrong, go back to school. But in education, we're educators in some way. How do we reach a bigger audience as educators and people who are concerned about the health of democracy, people who have ideas about what we might be doing, people who would like to learn from their counterparts? Jim, I'll start with you because you're an educator, as is Dimitri specifically. But what do you think? What do we do to improve the quality of our education to deal with the sorts of issues that we've been talking about this evening?
Sure, solve global education. That's easy. I'll take this. No, I think some of the things that people have talked about tonight are important. You know, if we're talking about students or the electorate, right? Where are they? What are they interested in? And it's our job to say, hey, these are some of the things that, you know, we need to encourage them to be thinking about and asking about and motivating them to be interested. Because if they either give up and say politics can't help me, right, or they turn negative on it, right, politics is really bad, then in a sense we failed, right? And it's our job to, you know, kind of help them think about ways of approaching all these things, and also to let them find their own paths, right? We wouldn't have wanted people in the 1930s or the 1970s to say, this is how you must do it in the 2020s. And in the same way, you know, we can't say, well, you can't judge based on podcasts because that's not how we did it in the 80s, right? People will find their information where we want to find it, and we have to help them access it and help them contextualize and say, hey, here's some things to think about. And, you know, my kind of win is when someone says, and whether it's a colleague or a voter or a student, hey, I hadn't thought of it like that before. That's really interesting, right? That's a success, right? Now you've started.
Okay, the light bulb moment.
I hadn't thought, you don't have to agree with me, but if you stop and say, that's it. That's a huge success. And now they're thinking, and now they're having conversations somewhere else. And that's terrific.
Okay, Dimitri?
I think that our role as educators is changing. I think that access to knowledge nowadays is so easy. What I see in the university that I work is people that know a lot of things, have access to a lot of knowledge, but their life skills are retreating. They can't collaborate as well as they could do. They cannot distinguish. They cannot critically engage with knowledge. They don't understand other people's feelings. They can't read facial expression. Things that, for my generation, you learn them in the playground. Today are missing. Okay. So the role of education is shifting, it seems to me, from a medium of delivering knowledge more like a treasure chest of equipping people with the emotional and critical capacities to make sense of knowledge.
Okay, excellent. Okay, great. That's great. Rikard, would you like to have the last word here? We've started with you, and now the onus is on you to agree with your colleagues.
No, I do. I mean, like, you know, I'm my colleagues here are educators. I'm just a journalist, but I do think there's a golden rule of journalism that I think actually applies to educators to a certain extent as well. It's like you have 2 ears, but only 1 mouth. And that indicates that you should listen twice as much as you talk. And I think that's very important, listening. Listen to people. And I've learned a lot listening to Jim and Dimitris and to you, David. And it's the same here. Listen a bit more, talk a bit less. And then we'll see.
Okay, well, let's hope that our listeners, the audience here on Nefsi's Web TV, have taken some of your advice to heart, and they've listened to us, and perhaps they'll communicate with us in another way, how they view the commentary and what they have to teach us. Let me just alert you all that we'll have another special episode of Dukakis Center Live tomorrow evening, same time, 7 p.m. Athens time. We'll be talking about global elections and U.S. foreign policy. I'll have John Koenig, the former U.S. ambassador to Cyprus, an old friend who's been on our program in the past, and Alan Makovsky from the American Center for Progress, a specialist on Eastern Mediterranean in particular, formerly congressional aide to Congressman Berman in the U.S. House of Representatives. So people who have actually public policy experience, they'll be reflecting on similar sorts of questions. Something in me tells me that they'll be a little more pessimistic. They're of an older generation, but they're also policy hands, and they're actually involved with decision making, and they know some of the pitfalls of populism and getting people to express opinions about things that they're not really knowledgeable about. So we'll see if we can balance some of the optimism that we've heard this evening with a little bit more hard-headed pragmatism tomorrow. I'm not suggesting that optimism is a bad thing. As an educator myself, if I didn't think my students had something to learn and something to teach me, then I wouldn't really be doing my job. This Dukakis Center Live, we're celebrating once again our 25th anniversary season of public service initiatives in northern Greece. And I'm very pleased that I was able to welcome this evening Rikard, Jim, and Dimitris on the program. So we'll take our lead now, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.